me, success is living in complete obedience to Jesus. It's not just looking at it from what external views of success might be, but really more what an eternal view of success would be.
God has given each of us special gifts, and it's our job to figure out what they are and where He would have us use them.
One has to trust God because nothing is guaranteed. Even health and the length of our life is not guaranteed.
Impacting the marketplace with our faith, that we demonstrate that faith every day in what we do, how we do it, that it leaves anybody that we do business with. They leave our presence with a desire to grow closer to God.
Hi everyone, my name is Tessa Needham and I'm the Programs and Events Manager for ELO. Welcome to this webinar with Rick Gosen and So-Young Kang on lessons on innovation in the digital economy. Before we get started, I'd just like to point out a few parameters for our live conversation today. Throughout the webinar, please submit all of your questions to the Q&A section and not to the chat section. You can find the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. Feel free to begin submitting questions at any time. We do encourage you to use the live chat feature to interact with one another. Introduce yourselves, where you're from, and your company or organization. A quick note on that, make sure that when you do go to the chat that you're set to send to all attendees and panelists, not just panelists. Rick and So-Young will not be monitoring the chat, so please use it to interact with one another and submit any of your questions to the Q&A. Additionally, this webinar is being recorded and everyone will be sent a follow-up email with the link for the recording. It will be also available on the ELO podcast in the coming days. I would like to now introduce Dr. Rick Gosen, Chairman, Advisory Board, ELO Group, and Strategic Counsel for Nicola Wealth, who will be interviewing So-Young Kang and hosting our conversation today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tessa. I appreciate that introduction. I'd like to welcome everyone to this webinar. Our topic is Lessons on Innovation in the Digital Economy. This is a topic that is of interest to a lot of people. It's very, very relevant, and we truly have an expert in the field who will be able to join us. Before I introduce her, I'd like to point out a few things, just to reiterate a few of the points that Tessa made already. One of the features of our ELO webinars is that we have a lot of interaction. So please ask as many questions as you would like. The point of this webinar is not so much a presentation, but rather a conversation. So I'll be interviewing So-Young Kang, but at the same time, please forward your questions. I'll integrate them as best I can during the course of our conversation. Again, as usual with one of our webinars, we have a great worldwide audience, and we picked the particular timing for this event so that we could capture people's attention in North America and also in Singapore. So in Singapore, it's in the morning. Here I'm on the West Coast. In North America, it's the evening. So the timing works well. At this point, I'd like to introduce So-Young Kang. So-Young Kang, there she is. Greetings, coming to us from, I shouldn't say coming to us from Singapore, because a lot of you watching are in Singapore. So So-Young Kang is in Singapore right now. She is the founder and CEO of Gnowbe and an expert in the digital economy. So we're really pleased to have you join us.
Thanks so much for having me, Rick. I'm excited to be here.
Great. Well, we're looking forward to the next hour. And just to reiterate to everyone, we'll go exactly an hour and we'll pack a lot in, questions that I'll be posing to So-Young and also questions from the audience. So So-Young, again, welcome. I'm very much looking forward to your insights. And before we get to some of the insights, let's just start off with your background. So just tell us what type of family you grew up in and what were the values of your family?
Sure. I have to say that this is the first webinar I've done where we started with a really deep and meaningful question. So I really appreciate that. I guess, so I grew up in Brooklyn, New York. And, I think I had two sets of values growing up, East and West. My mother had more Korean or Asian values, which is all about studying hard, working hard, performing. And then my father, who's also Korean, but had adopted more, I'm going to call it American values, really valued independence, freedom of thoughts, curiosity, and questioning. And so, as you can imagine, there was some conflict between those two sets of values, but I'm probably the mix of both.
Was there any entrepreneurial aspect of your upbringing in terms of what your parents did work-wise?
100%. My father was an entrepreneur, serial entrepreneur. My uncles on my father's side, all entrepreneurs. So I guess being an entrepreneur is in my blood. And so I started earning money when I was 11. So I guess I actually just always grew up with it.
Okay. So what did you do at 11 years old?
So I started to play the piano when I was 4. And I did my first public performance when I was 5, I think. And I started teaching when I was 11. I started teaching to the Sunday school kids at my church. And then it turned out into this thing. So by the time I was in high school, I had about 10 students ranging from the age of 5. And my eldest student, my most mature student, was 80 years old. And yeah, I loved her. She was great.
So that would definitely have impacted your marketing technique to hit the young market and also the octogenarians.
Yeah, I guess so.
All right, so that's actually quite interesting because I now want to ask, before we get to your entrepreneurial career, you started off after high school going to university. So just describe, did you park your entrepreneurial ambition? So just describe where you did your degrees and how that impacted your business journey.
Sure. So I actually went to high school in Florida, to Brandon. I saw someone here is from Florida, so I went to Brandon High School, and I ended up accidentally going to the University of Pennsylvania. And so when I say accidentally, I had a very non-traditional background in that my family was not so obsessed with school and college and where I went to school, which is very odd for many Asian families. But my family, that was not a high value of my family. So I accidentally went there. And so I think the entrepreneurial thing was something that I think as a child, I said, when I was 8 years old, I had a vision, I'd be an entrepreneur. I had no idea what I would do, but I had that vision, and then you grow up and you forget about that dream. And then when I went to university, it was more, exploring. I think, college is a time of exploration. So I went from being, I want to be a diplomat to, I want to, so I kind of forgot the entrepreneurial thing. And so then I, ended up, working for a couple of years after college in Japan and at Citi. And then I thought, okay, now I'm ready to start my company.
Well, let me just interrupt there. So if we go back to your university days, I know you're being modest, but you went to a little known school called Harvard for your business degree. And maybe just explain to people a bit of the dynamic at an Ivy League school, because often they'll say people go to Harvard Business School actually not to be entrepreneurs, but rather to be investment bankers, corporate executives. So just describe that environment in terms of, did it foster your entrepreneurial spirit that, you thought one day when I get out, I'm now really equipped to be an entrepreneur? Or did it say, you know what, I could do well in a corporate environment, just stick with that?
Yeah, no, it's a really, really good question. In fact, I think I became less entrepreneurial after going to Harvard Business School, and then even less so when I worked for McKinsey. But I did actually go there to become not really to become an entrepreneur, because I feel like that was already in me. I think it was more this idea that I wanted to run a global company one day, and I wanted to network with people who would help me to build this company, to build community. So I went to business school, I would say less to learn. I mean, of course, I had to learn technical skills like finance. I didn't know finance or accounting, because I had come from a sales and marketing background. So I think those technical things were important, but it was more to learn how to think, like a leader. Because I think the leadership part, I think, is much more difficult than learning the technical skills of, entrepreneurship, because it's about character. So I think it was to go and learn about myself and to build a network with lots of different people.
So let's say business school gave you a lot of the tools and the equipment to succeed. Was there a bit of a turning point in terms of wanting to pursue the entrepreneurial journey? So, let's say you're at McKinsey or you're in a company, and then at what point did you say, you know what, I'm going to make the entrepreneurial leap?
Yeah. So the funny thing is I wanted to. I think the desire to be an entrepreneur was implanted in my heart when I was a child, and it was forgotten about. And then, in 2001, I tell the story because I think God has a sense of humor, and this is where I think my faith plays a journey. In 2001, I was applying to business school. And, as I was applying to one of the top business schools, I applied to Harvard, Penn, Kellogg, et cetera. And I said, God, I don't really have the credentials to get in on my own, when I look at the credentials. And so I said, God, if you get me accepted to one of the top business schools in the world, I promise you the company I start one day, I'll dedicate it to you. So the promise went something like that. I think many of us have prayed a similar promise when we're, desperate to get what we want. And then 8 years later, 2008, Thanksgiving Sunday, I forgot about the promise, of course, because that was not really a serious promise. And then I kind of forgot the promise. And then about 8 years later, God called me on that promise. And so that is then what catapulted me in to start my entrepreneurial journey. So it was something forgotten about, and it was in my heart to always start something. But when I was in business school, I couldn't start my companies. I did about 10 business plans. I was a president of the Entrepreneurship Club at Harvard, the co-president of the Entrepreneurship Club. And I had about 10 to 15 business ideas. I had one that I was ready. I spent a whole year working on, and I couldn't start it. And I only knew 10 years later why I couldn't start the company.
Well, what was the reason? Like, what caused you not to get out of the gate with that idea?
I think it comes down to purpose. So at that time, I couldn't put my finger on what it was. And so it was a fashion technology company, and so I was going to start this fashion technology company. And then I thought, okay, so what happens? I'll leave, I'll have a successful season. And then what? I'll have another successful season. And then what? I'll have another successful season, right? So at the end of the day, I couldn't figure out what the bigger purpose was of why I was doing this business, other than I thought it was an interesting business opportunity. And so there was something inside of me that just, I don't know, I couldn't pull the trigger. But then, and I didn't know why. There was no specific reason. So instead I worked for McKinsey. So I was like, okay, let me buy time while I figure out what what I really want to do in life, and learn how to think like a global CEO. And so it wasn't until like 10 years later when I really spent time, in my faith, understanding and uncovering and discovering my purpose, that I was like, oh, now I can start any kind of business. When you know your why, it doesn't really matter what company you start. I think that's less important than the why.
Well, that's a great segue, because my next question related to, what would you view as your calling, and how your business activities fit into that?
Yeah, and I think it's, and it's a calling that started 10 years ago. And it's really to maximize human creative potential. And so, I think over the years it gets refined, little by little, as I learn more about who I am as a human. and who I am and who I've been created to be. But it's always been kind of around this maximization, this development of people and creativity. And so then you kind of go back to the first job I had, which was teaching people, and it was never thought to be a career, right? It was meant to be like my weekend job. But then you kind of fast forward and then you look at the thread of things that I had done, even when I was doing strategy or marketing. There was always an element of teaching, developing, helping, and so now that I kind of know that that is my life purpose, then my companies are just reflections of that, and the things that I do.
Well, that's a great way to put it, because sometimes when I talk to people about calling, I'll say God plans in advance of our ability to understand. So sometimes we arrive at a certain point in our life and then we realize we're actually completely prepared to fulfill our calling, and it redeems the various experiences we had in the past that may have seemed disconnected or disjointed.
Yeah, it's
You're allowed
almost
to
like,
say amen if you'd like.
yeah, no, absolutely. It's so true, right? It's like I'm always, and so I'm amazed as as my vision was being uncovered and discovered as I was discovering it, and feeling completely inadequate to do the things that I thought he was calling me to do 10 years ago. The first company that I started was Awaken Group, and it's a leadership company. I felt completely ill-equipped to start that company for many, many reasons. And and as I started to build the company and learn about who I was as a human and as a leader, like, what does it mean to be a leader? Like, what does that mean, right? And it was amazing, because then you start to see the connections. It's almost like the goggles come off and you're like, oh my God, like I actually had these talents, the raw talents, and they were very raw. So a lot of them had to be really refined and honed and sharpened over the years, still sharpening, still refining as we go. But the raw materials and the core talents that God had placed and planted in each of us, right? Which I think it just kind of blows your mind.
Well, maybe just elaborate on that point for people who are listening in. So the one point I'd like you to just talk about a bit is, so on the one hand, we might have a certain element of training, but then when we get into the business world, we're actually confronting things that we haven't yet experienced, may feel we're not actually equipped to be able to do. So just talk about how your previous experiences have to be, in a sense, leveraged in new ways. Like how did that dynamic work in your life?
Yeah, well, I think it goes in a couple of ways. I think one, it's we learn from our experiences, good and bad. And we should never waste, obviously, a crisis. And so as you go through these different experiences, and maybe like I'm stubborn, right? So I have to, you tell me don't touch it, it's hot, and I go, okay, let me see, and I touch it, and oh, yep, you're right, it's hot. And so I think life, and work experiences are kind of similar, where I had to make a lot of mistakes and try different things as I was uncovering and discovering the things that I was called to do. And you need those things. So it's not a linear path. So in some ways, had I known my calling when I was X number, like a child, or when I was in the university, I may have tried to take a more linear path towards that. But I think that may make me less successful. Nothing, and I'm pretty certain it would have made me less effective at doing the things I'm eventually meant to do, because that circuitous route of what seemed to be totally disjointed, right? Of like, Citibank, marketing, Japan, like what, and then it's only in hindsight, where you have 2020 and you look back and then you see the threads of what, God is kind of, what I'm learning along that journey, but then the core bits were there. They would just had to be uncovered at the right time. And I think timing is so important in this, in terms of maturity, experience. And so you can't rush some of these things. And this is coming from someone who's very impatient, who wants things to always be done faster. Like God is always too slow for me, right? I'm like, I want to do this, and, but then when you look back, it's always the perfect time.
Well, I think one of the key points you've made is something that I think would apply to a lot of people listening, which is we sometimes think that our calling and our progress on our calling moves in a linear fashion, when in fact it doesn't. So, but we have this idea that yes, that will somehow make a mistake. So like you described in your career, you did a bunch of different things. Now, when you were going through that, did you feel I'm not seeing the pattern, or it feels disjointed? And were other people saying to you, well, shouldn't you, settle into something, so how did you cope with that? Because
All
it's,
the time. I still feel that way. I mean, I'm on my second company, so I think I still feel that way. But a funny story is, so now my late father, one of the things he said to me, I still remember. So he said this to me all the time since I was a child. He said, focus on one thing. You like too many things. Just focus on one. You don't have to be a straight A student. So definitely non-very Asian, right? Don't be a straight A student. He said, you can be a C student. Just pick one thing that you get A's in and focus on that. So that's definitely not a very Asian thing to say. My father was quite unique, but anyways, and he said, your problem is that, you have too many things that you like to do, pick one. So there was always obviously that tension between what I call like wisdom, like, natural wisdom, pick one thing, be good at that thing and pursue that for the rest of your life. I think we're living in a different world now. And, we're having multiple careers, we're living longer, we're on this journey. And so this journey of constantly uncovering and feeling uncomfortable, I feel uncomfortable all the time, even today, there are things on my journey as a tech entrepreneur that, wow, I'm like, gender discrimination, never knew what that meant until I became a tech entrepreneur. Even though I am obviously an Asian American female, grew up in the US my whole life, I didn't experience much gender discrimination because maybe the nature, the cities that I lived in and the companies I worked for. And I became a tech entrepreneur. I've experienced more gender discrimination in Silicon Valley than I have anywhere else in the world, right? And so there are things that you're always learning. So how do I deal with that? What does that mean? How do I respond?
Well, that's one question. I want to get back to the gender discrimination question and the whole dynamic of women entrepreneurs, and then specifically women entrepreneurs in Silicon Valley, because probably, myself and probably a lot of other people have read about how it's apparently even a worse environment than the norm. So we'll definitely get back to that. I wanted to just focus on your company. So you mentioned Awaken a little bit, but let's maybe focus on Gnowbe. So I'd like to make sure people understand enough about Gnowbe. So just start off with, how did you come up with the idea, and what is it?
Sure. It's actually a spin out of Awaken Group. So my two companies are sister companies. So Gnowbe was spun out of Awaken, which does transformation design work. And leadership, workshops, consulting, advisory is a big part of that work. Now, the challenge with that is, of course, as we know, the human experience is very high touch, very difficult to scale coaching, leadership development. And, pre-COVID, many of us thought that we couldn't do any of this online. I think COVID has taught us that we can do amazing conversations online as well. But, I had this desire, how do we take that human experience and scale that to, if you have 10,000 employees, 100,000 employees, or 1 million? And so we spun and we crafted Gnowbe to be a platform that would allow us to scale the human experience. So what does that mean? We allow people to put multimedia content because we're multifaceted. We don't like to only talk and listen and do Q&A. We like to, interact. We like to take selfies and videos. We like to chat. We like to engage with each other in a community. So we took all those elements of the human experience, we digitized it to allow anyone to create that type of experience, and also to engage and learn from other people in that way, which is actually a much more human way of engaging. And so our platform allows for authoring as well as access to content. So it's a mobile micro learning platform for communications, engagement, and training.
So perhaps give an example of one client, and maybe a client that, like a bank or somebody or an institution that's familiar to most of us, and just explain why they bought it, why they use the service, and how they benefit from it.
Sure. So I'll take SAP. So SAP is a large global technology company, and they were ranked #1 in diverse employee of the year for diversity and inclusion. So they care a lot about this passion, and for them, diversity and inclusion is not just about ethnic diversity, but also like differently abled. So they have a program called Autism at Work, and they want to equip all of the different managers globally across SAP on how to manage, employees that might be on the spectrum. So they notified that course or that program, which used to be probably in PowerPoint decks, etc. They notify that so that people could engage, can interact, could actually ask questions.
Sorry, So-Young, I have to say, you use the term Gnowbify.
Oh yes, notify, yes.
Just so people know, it's Gnowbe, and then Gnowbify is the verb.
Yes, I'm sorry about that. I just know I'm using it like habitually. I didn't realize it. Yes. So yes, so so Notified means that they digitize in mobile micro experiential ways in a really fun, engaging way. So they did that, roll it out to their managers. That program is fantastic. So that's one way that they're using it. So they used our authoring and kind of multimedia authoring tools in order to craft a really powerful experience to train their managers on how to be better leaders. So that's kind of one example.
So maybe because I've a few questions that have come in related to a bit more explanation on Gnowbe. So maybe give an example of, let's say, an entrepreneur with a handful of employees. Like, how can they use it? Like, why?
Oh, yeah. If you're an entrepreneur, which, so we have a less than 30 employees at Gnowbe. Without Gnowbe, we would not be able to survive. So we use it for everything from recruiting new candidates, because we used to get stacks of resumes and I don't have time to go through all the resumes. And I think resumes are a waste of paper. I think they're a waste of time. So I'm sorry if any of you are in that industry. I've actually given a keynotes to search people and said, resumes are a waste of paper. Please stop doing that. So we don't do resumes. We have everyone notify a program where they put their resume of why they should be hired in a Gnowbe program. We learn about their creativity, critical thinking, communication skills. All of you can do that for free, by the way. It's free. So you can go ahead and do that. So there's the resume. So from a recruiting perspective, we're learning about the candidate in a much more holistic way. We're getting a sense of their critical thinking, creativity, communication skills.
Sorry, just to be clear. So you're learning that, so there's the content, but you're learning that by the manner in which they interact with Gnowbe, the way they fill it out, how long they take for certain tasks, or?
No, the way that they create their own program. So Gnowbe is an authoring tool. So everyone can download Gnowbe. Everyone goes to the app, so you can download it, and you'd be able to start creating your own program. And so for all potential hires of Gnowbe, they have to create a new program. So what we're looking for is curiosity, willingness to try and learn new things, adaptability. Are they able to learn a new technology with no training, right? So they just go and figure it out. So we use it from that. So they create their own resume, but it's like their resume come to life. It's a 3D resume because they put videos in there, right? Portfolio links, etc. So we start there. And then as soon as they get hired, then we do the entire onboarding experience in Gnowbe. Onboarding 101 on the vision, mission, and values of the company, of all the SOPs, HR policies. They go through product training. They go through sales training. Then we have like cybersecurity training around so that cybersecurity course is by KPMG. So we subscribe to content. They have to go through the KPMG cybersecurity course. And then now for the sales team, product team, each team have their own. So the marketing team is creating a marketing playbook of all the common terms, because people don't know what Gnowbify means. So what does Gnowbify mean? So that would be in the book. In the sales playbook has all of the different sales techniques and strategies. And then the sales manager, everyone can create their own content. So because it's an authoring tool that anyone is empowered to use, your employees now can start to author, just like they would use PowerPoint to create a deck. They can use Gnowbe instead of PowerPoint in order to do that. So in fact, all of our webinars now are Gnowbified. So we don't use PowerPoint anymore for our webinars because we just find it less interactive to do a PowerPoint. So we'll put it in Gnowbe, and all the participants will get Gnowbe in their phone. So as the presentation is going on, they're doing polls, they're interacting with each other, and then they take that presentation with them in their pocket, and they have it with them all the time.
Right.
It's a really new way of thinking about content.
Well, do you find, what would be the challenge in having people use Gnowbe? Is it's something new? It takes a bit of a, like, what are some of the challenges? And then tie that into just the nature of our present society with innovation, change, new things we all have to learn.
Yeah, I think the challenge is I would say it's been common for humanity, right? It's change, new ways of doing things, disruption, and because what we're doing is a new way of engaging with content. So in the e-learning space, for the past 10 to 15 years, many of us believe e-learning equals videos with a quiz at the end. So our definition, when we think, we have an image in our head, which is, because the MOOCs have been so successful, like the Udemy's or the Coursera's of the world. So we see that and we think e-learning, video, someone talking at me for X number of minutes, and then I get a quiz to test my memory of that content. And the education system is a lot like that too. But when we think about technology and the way that humans engage, we engage in this way. So like I'm learning from you, you learn from me through dialogue, and actually if we challenge each other, we disagree even better, because then we'll sharpen the edges of our thinking even more. And so,
but what if I'm learning a lot more from you than you are from me?
I doubt that with your experience. So, but the whole idea of how we engage is through the social dialogue, is through this participation. If you're going to learn how to do sales, I'm sorry, you can't learn sales by watching 10 videos on sales. I can take a quiz and get 100% on that quiz, and I still may not be good at sales. The only way that I become good at sales is I practice doing my pitches, right? You got to get up to bat multiple times and swing the bat, right? And that's what we do in Gnowbe. Like, you have it in the platform. You upload videos of yourselves practicing your pitch. Your manager gives you feedback. The manager throws you an objection, and you're like, oh, I got to respond to that objection. Then you say, oh, I see how, Rick did such a great job. I'm going to copy Rick. So you're really you have the ability to develop skills, capabilities, and again, this is one use case, right? But this is like this is a way that you can use the platform.
So just so people understand it clearly, if they use Gnowbe, what would they stop using, and what is it comparable to? So in other words, am I shifting everything I'm doing onto yet another platform, so to speak?
Yeah. Well, I think I'll just take the webinar world, because everyone is in Zoom, in Zoom world these days. So I don't think it would replace Zoom, because Zoom basically replaces the face-to-face. Instead of being in a physical room with you, we're using the Zoom camera to replicate that. What it would do, it would complement that. So if Gnowbe were used now, and in this case, you and I are not using PowerPoint, it would replace PowerPoint, and it would replace chat a bit, because it would be used inside that, so in the phone, so that you'd be able to engage with that content with the person who's talking. So it complements a new way of thinking of content. If you're thinking from a company context, it's replacing PDFs, content sitting in an intranet, PDF documents, or materials that sit somewhere in someone's inbox that's never accessible and never seen by anyone. Or it replaces those training manuals that gather dust that you have in your office after every program, and then every once in a while you look at it, or if you're going to leave the job, then you end up pulling all those manuals out and throwing that away. It replaces that. So it digitizes all of that stuff, puts it in your pocket, makes it accessible when you need it. So it's both replacing but also enhancing. It's creating a much more social experience.
Right. Well, maybe just describe a little bit about the entrepreneurial / business side of Gnowbe. So how did you start it? Did you bootstrap it? Did you get investors? And what's sort of the corporate finance plan behind Gnowbe?
Sure. So when I spun it out of Awaken, it was just a concept. So I was doing leadership development training and design thinking. Now, I think, as you know, from a leadership, even face-to-face, is really hard. It's hard to get leaders to think differently, to be transformed in their mind. We talk about change. It's hard, right? And so I said, well, do we think that we can really help leaders be more effective and change their behavior, or people to be more innovative through our design thinking course? on a mobile, by the way, we're on the web as well. So mobile or web, digital experience, self-directed in bite-sized ways. Is that possible? That was the hypothesis. So I wasn't sure. I didn't buy it, okay? And I wasn't sure, I wasn't convinced. So I talked to some investors and we got some angel funds and we said, let's just build this prototype out. So we got some investors, $200,000. We built the prototype out. We tested both courses in 6 countries in Asia, across Asia and the US. As a coach, I can read the qualitative and quantitative answers of what my participants or students say, and I know when they've gotten it. So I was actually floored when I read the reflections of what people were talking about in the leadership program, my leadership program that I had run face-to-face for years. I used to run it as a 3-day workshop, right? A 3-day experiential workshop. And I could see the insights that they were gathering, which were very similar to what I would have gotten from a 3-day workshop. We've run 5-day design thinking workshops, and I would see that they were creating prototypes of products as a result of my design thinking course on a mobile phone. I was like, what? And so after that, we realized, wow, this actually works. You can take the same methodology or similar methodology from designing a very powerful human experience, use the technology to then enable that, and get very similar and sometimes even more effective results using technology. That was my big aha moment. Once that happened, then we did serious fundraising. So then I raised a couple $1 million. So we've been funded by investors and venture capitalists.
Sorry, you said quite quickly, oh yeah, we raised a couple $1 million. So maybe just scroll back a bit, because of course, people in the audience, some may have access to raise a couple million, but of course there's always, so let's say, why did you not say to yourself, you know what, I have some of my own resources, I'll bootstrap this, I want to be in control, versus I presumably you put together an offering memorandum and said, hey, round 1 or series A, I'm giving up X%. So why did you go the route you did? Because presumably you considered the various options.
I did, but I think when it comes to technology, a couple of things. I think one is I'm not a technologist by background. And so in order for me to really build a company, a tech company in this area, you need to have really, I think, great tech talent. So, and this is more of a belief, than data-driven thing, but I don't believe in outsourcing the core product. So if our core product is technology, we need to have developers in-house and to develop this product. And so, and it's not cheap to have a development team in-house, and it's not like it's not an outsourced project to another country for $30,000. I mean, you don't build a product like Gnowbe with that, right? And so I had a higher development team, which would require significant amount of resources. And because it was a disruptive idea, even when we started, it was even much more disruptive. Micro-learning was not a thing when we started. Now people at least know what micro-learning is. They didn't even know what it was when we started.
Maybe just to reiterate for people, just give us the short definition of micro definition of micro-learning.
1 to 3 minute bites of content. Mm-hmm. And when you string together the 1 to 3 minute bites of content into a program, you can have a 3-hour program, which is broken up into little bits. Our conversation is actually micro-learning. Every comment you make is about 1 to 2 minutes, and so is mine. So we're having a micro conversation right now. Humans engage with content in micro ways. We just don't think of it that way.
And then with Gnowbe, you have a system so that people can track the micro steps along the way and keep building on it. Okay, so we've had the different questions keep coming in. So they might not always go exactly with the flow, but I want to make sure we get in as many as we can. So one question related to how are your Christian values reflected in what either Gnowbe does or how it operates?
Very much, I would say, I think my beliefs really are the foundation for both of my companies. So Gnowbe's vision is to humanize the world. So the idea of humanize the world is, if you were to ask people who was the most human that ever lived in the world that we know of. And I think many of us might say Jesus Christ was the most human that ever lived. And I say, I think the idea of humanizing the world is really about, helping the world to become much more conscious, much kinder, much more authentic and beautiful. And so our corporate values are around being authentic, beautiful, and borderless, which I think kind of encapsulate. And so, I think you can see my beliefs, my faith are very much, I think, at the foundation of the corporate values and vision and mission that we serve.
Mm-hmm. There's one not quite sorry, random question, but why are you in Singapore? Obviously sent by a Singaporean. We said you're Korean, American, Silicon Valley. What are you doing in Singapore?
That's a great question. So as a pre-COVID, I spend about half my time in the US, in California, and I have an office. My head of engineering is actually, in the Bay Area. And I have a team in the US, a team in Europe, and a team in Singapore. I came here 10 years ago to start and build Awaken Group because of one of my mentors. That's how I first ended up here. I have no familial ties to Singapore. I'm obviously not Singaporean, but I came here because a mentor was here, and then Awaken Group started to grow. And then when I spun Gnowbe out of Awaken, Singapore is a great market for, it's mobile first. They get it. They get this concept. It's a great test bed for testing new products, new concepts, very open to new innovation, much faster on that adoption curve, which I think was an earlier question you had asked. Because tech adoption is hard. Adoption in general of anything is hard. New tech adoption is really hard. Getting someone to download your app is hard, no matter what the app is. It could be the best thing since sliced bread and people don't want to download another app, right? So all of that, it takes time. And so Asia is definitely much faster when it comes to these things. So we learned a lot. And it just made sense to have a presence here.
Yeah, well, that's great. And of course, not everybody will make the move to, have an office or have an operation in another part of the world. So that's great. So there's a question here. So this is a good friend of mine, Bill Fu, who's chairman of ELO in Singapore, involved in a lot of businesses. And in particular, he's director of a hotel group in Singapore with operations in other parts of Asia also. So his question is, what kind of learning and development and skills and attitudes in a new post-COVID environment, in light of all these travel restrictions, would be suitable for the hotel industry? Where there's very little. So he points out, I mean, there's not really a domestic travel industry. Everybody's coming, presumably, unless they're coming down from KL or something, but they're presumably flying in. So if you're in the hotel industry, how could you train, what skills and how could you train that through Gnowbe?
Yeah, no, I think it's a really great question. Well, I think there's probably different aspects of the business. I would say starting from the front line, I think this need to be human, I think is a skill that actually almost predated COVID, right? It's like the pre-COVID world and post-COVID. But, teaching, especially in Singapore or in Asia, this idea of humanizing your staff experiences within connections with customers, as opposed to being a staff and a customer, nameless, faceless, to Rick and So-Young having a conversation. And if I were, working at the hotel serving you, Rick, my customer, how can I understand you, Rick, as a human and your preferences, and then do a really good job, even if it's a really brief, from a brief greeting to an acknowledgement of your humanity, to, additional services that are provided. So the way that the technology or Gnowbe would help with that would be that you would provide scenarios, you would train them, and that's really up to the company training team. So they would create and craft these experiences and give me, the employee, a chance to practice and develop those skills and get feedback and coaching from my managers to improve the way that I show up. It could be having me upload a video of myself greeting a brand new customer. Then another scenario might be, greet someone who you've seen 5 times stay at your hotel. How do you treat them? Say to them. right?
So the thing you mentioned a few times that I want to highlight. Now you use the term or the phrase humanize. So I think that's something that people should just make note of, in the sense of course, there's a trend with when we move into this digital world, everything's automated. Like, as an example, you cannot phone Amazon. They don't want you to phone. So you always feel like you're reduced to a credit card number. So where did this notion for you come from of, humanize, like using, humanizing?
Yeah, I think it's exactly what you just said, Rick. I think there's this fear of technology, and there's lots of fears, loss of jobs. You see all these reports about how technology and robots are going to take your jobs. AI is going to take your jobs. But the truth is, we have been automating for thousands of years. We've always been automating. And while there are some kind of jobs that get lost in automation and in disruption, new jobs are created. I think what's happened is the times for that disruption have gotten shortened, right? And compressed. And so in the face of rapid technology and automation, I think if we're not really conscious and intentional about the human experience, we have the risk of losing ourselves in that process. Because at the rate we're going, we are rapidly dehumanizing ourselves, our next generation, where we're basically creating this mindless, thoughtless group of people who literally are just numbing themselves. They used to be the TV, and now we are mind numbing ourselves with phones and technologies.
And again, one question relates to this: how do you amplify or integrate like a kingdom mission? So I would think, from a faith standpoint, humanizing, recognizing the created individual is quite important to you.
I see, yeah, and it's absolutely critical. So micro learning in and of itself is not transformative. It's the participant, we call it MPPG. Micro learning is a mobile micro, it's a participation, the personalization, and the group-based piece of that, which is very, very human.
So you called it NTPG?
Oh, like mobile, right. Participatory, personalized, group-based.
So just so everybody knows, as Tessa mentioned, we will have a recording available. So we're throwing out enough nuggets that you need to watch the recording to absorb all that. Okay, so we've got 12 minutes left, and we like to stick with our schedule. Presumably people in Singapore have to finish and then finish their breakfast and get off to the office. But so just on the digital economy side, we'll just maybe summarize what would be a couple of lessons that people, whatever business they're in, just a few big picture things for people to think about.
Yeah, I think one is we really need to think about technology not as something that's just that the IT group has to think about. So technology is now embedded into the human experience, into the customer experience, into the employee experience. So we think we need to have a different mindset as we think about technology now, and especially in our companies and organizations, where it's really thinking about the end user experience. And I think it's no longer sufficient to have really clunky enterprise software that people don't like to use. So I think that the democratization and the accessibility of technology for anyone in the company, I think, is really important as we think about that. And I think that the easier and the more social and the more connected we make that in order to foster human connection, especially in this post-COVID world where mental, emotional health are issues, I think is really, really important. We need to think about technology to connect, not to deconnect and not to dehumanize. I mean, of course, you have technology for productivity purposes, which is fine. But at the same time, you need to balance that out with other tech that's intentionally designed for connection. Right? Otherwise, you can't counterbalance that.
Right. Well, we have time for a handful of questions yet. I did want to circle back on the gender discrimination issue. So just to frame the question for our listeners, it's interesting because you're an Christian entrepreneur, female, Korean American, and then to make it even worse, you're in the high tech sector. I mean, this is like
triple one. It's like triple, quadruple one.
It's like the triple whammy. So, I mean, we're not making light of it, of course, but just talk about the challenges. Because I mean, you read these articles in various publications that Silicon Valley, in particular, has very little female representation. So maybe just talk about that issue and what you've experienced and why all of us should be bothered by what's happening.
Yeah. Well, I'll just share a stat. Less than 3% of funding, for venture capitalists went to female owned or female managed startups. Less than 3%. About half our population, right? So, I mean, that's a staggering, I think it used to be 1%, and then it's kind of maybe around 3% now. So that's a staggering number. And so I think, when we think about those differences, and then there's also additional research that shows that female-run startups with the same amount of capital given will outperform a male-run startup with the same amount of capital given. And, and there's research on that, right? That's interesting. Yeah, and so, you kind of look at those and you go, and when you talk to women, it's different because it's much harder to be a female in tech, because the starting assumption is you don't know what you're doing. So you're starting from, instead of starting from, I assume that you're awesome, Rick, and you can run this great tech company. And so because my ingoing assumption is that you can do it, whereas if I'm speaking to the female tech, I assume she can't. So she's starting from already a lower place. So then you have to build yourself up to get to the same level before then you can move to the next level. So a lot of it is really unconscious bias. I don't think people intentionally go around thinking I'm going to, dehumanize and treat someone. I don't think many people do that. It's very unconscious. Even myself, I'm so used to, I think, apologizing for things and being overly, polite. And I'm so used to answering questions in a way that's defensive because I'm constantly having to prove myself. I'm just used to it. So I don't know any other way of being. And it wasn't until I started to read articles and talk to male entrepreneurs and say, oh, what did that guy ask you? And then I realized the questions they get asked are really different from the questions I get asked. And there's some fantastic articles about like the different questions that female and male entrepreneurs get asked. The male entrepreneur will be asked about your vision. So tell me, Rick, how are you going to conquer the world with your fabulous technology? I get asked questions like, how do you know you're going to make that many, how do you know you're going to be able to have business and, and have people buy your product? Tell me, explain to me your product. Why does it work? Why does it work? Why does it work? Whereas men will get asked like, I just assume it works. Let's just talk about how awesome it's going to be. And I'm being kind of extreme here in my examples, but it's some form of that, right? And it's unconscious bias. And so I think what's important for the females who are listening, and for the men, is to be aware of the questions you're asking and what unconscious bias do we have when you're actually asking females questions. Are you assuming that they already have the product and are going to be awesome? Or are you asking them to prove themselves subconsciously? I think as a female, understanding that, now I go, oh, I see. Then I actually answer the other question. So if I get asked the question to defend myself, I will answer the question about why I think this is going to be, the next big thing and reach 5 billion people in the world. So then I share my vision. So I elevate the conversation. Just, you know what I mean? So it goes both ways.
Right. No, that's a great explanation. And we've got time for a handful more questions. There's a few key things I wanted to just address quickly. So maybe this ties into your previous answer, but, as an entrepreneur, what's maybe been one big challenge, and then what's been one phenomenal opportunity or great success moment? We'll start with the bad one, and we'll build up to the really good one.
Yeah, well, there are always two sides of the same coin, right? But I would say the biggest challenge is yourself. I think as an entrepreneur, it is, and I keep looking at, your sign, Christian marketplace leaders, right? And I think the journey of an entrepreneur is the most humbling experience I think that anyone can ever go through. So I highly recommend it. If you want to do leadership development, become an entrepreneur, because it is so humbling. Every flaw that you have is magnified by your culture and the people that you see around you. If you're the leader, it's not just entrepreneur. If you're the CEO, the president, the leader of a company or an organization, you see the flaws of your company. And, it's like looking at the mirror, like with, magnified 100 times. Like every wart, zit that you had is there. And so I think it's a very humbling experience, when you have a lot of pressure and you have a lot of things to do. And I'm constantly, being confronted with myself, mindset limitation, belief limitations, assumptions that maybe I used to hold to realize that they're not true anymore. So it's this constant questioning and saying, God, why? What are you telling me in this journey? And how do I need to adapt myself? How do I need to change my leadership style? The leadership style when I was in the first part of my journey is now different. It's not going to work for me in this part of the leadership journey. So I have to adapt a different leadership style, right?
Right.
And it's hard. It's hard enough to have one leadership style, and so you're just constantly having to. So that's, I would say, the biggest challenge is myself. And
the great reward or opportunity,
I think, is really the potential to build, an ecosystem of partners, of people. So for me, what I get very excited about is being able to collaborate and build an ecosystem of partners, of people who have similar beliefs, and build something bigger than yourself. So I think the moment things go beyond yourself into this ecosystem where other people are carrying that mission and vision out, that I think that's something that will outlive me, right? And it's never about, I think, the founder. I think it's about the vision and mission that you have and how do you empower people and equip them with that. And that's really, really exciting.
Yeah, no, that's great. I have 2 questions left. Second last question. Now, highlight maybe one aspect of it's a massive question, but the difference between East and West. So you're sort of a product of the 2 cultures. So what's just one, maybe it's even a funny thing, but just some difference you've noticed quite starkly between being in the West, in North America, than being in Asia?
I'll just share a quick story. It took me a few years to learn this story. We had a team that we were working with in Singapore, and we were working on this massive project. And leading up to the project and the final client meeting, I said to the team, hey guys, we need to address this one issue because, that's probably, be something that the client cares about, and we need to work on that issue. And the team said, okay. Lead up to the meeting, we had the big client meeting, and those things were not addressed. So naturally, I was upset. I said, guys, I told you about those 2 issues. Why were they not upset? And we sat in the debrief meeting, and then, at 6 or 7, guys, Asian, and they were all looking down. They were waiting for the scolding to come. And I had this. This is like, a few years, being here and being frustrated because this had not been the first time that it happened. That had happened multiple times. And then finally, I said, can I ask you guys a question? Would you rather ask for help or be scolded? And I asked each and every single guy to say, person there to answer the question. 100% of them, all of them, said they would rather be scolded. And as an American, I was floored. Like I was so in disbelief by what I had heard that I had to ask it again. So when you talk about the differences between East and West, and of course, obviously this is a huge topic, right? And I know, when you talk about cultural diversity and integration, but I think just that one story for me was a big aha moment that we are speaking 2 very different languages and we have very different worldviews. And I tried to understand why they prefer to be scolded than ask for help. And their answer was fascinating. They basically said, as our leader, we assume that you know our capabilities and you know what we can and cannot do. So if you give us a task and we can't do it, it must be because we're incapable. But if we ask you for help, it's basically telling you that you gave us a task that we could not do on our own. So we don't want you to lose face by asking you for help.
Yeah, no, that's a great example. So we have 1 minute left. So just to wrap up, what's maybe a parting word of encouragement or insight that you'd like to leave with people?
I guess at the end of the day, on this journey, it's really a journey that we're on. our leadership journeys and our personal journeys. And I think the more time you spend in silence, in prayer, and listening, the more joyful our journey would be. And so I think it's about focusing on the journey, not the destination, and kind of allow God to take you where he's going to take you, because those places he takes you are far better, far richer, far more beautiful than even places that we have the creativity to imagine ourselves.
That's a great note on which to wrap up the webinar. Well, So-Young, I've really enjoyed it. We've been getting great activity on the chat and also lots of great questions. And for everybody listening, this will be available via recording. I'm sure we'll get lots of people watching it again or watching it for the first time. So thank you again to everybody for listening. Thank you, So-Young, and have a good rest of the day in Singapore, and have a good evening if you're somewhere in North America.